So there's obviously a lot of different ways that you could categorize pedals, but this is kind of clearing things up in my head a bit.
This channel is supported by Truefire. Truefire is an online
Look,
library of
enough. You can get the Truefire All Access Pass for as cheap as they ever do it, the $99 thing. So just jump and do that if you're looking for the best price that you can get Truefire All Access for.
So I was looking at my pedal board, plugged it in, got some sounds out of it. It was kind of like, all right, well, those sound like, you know, mediocre. Into Fender Deluxe Reverb, I was plugged into it with an attenuator on. Maybe that's part of the issue. But it got me thinking about, like, how many drive pedals does one person really need? And the way that I wanted to start this off really was looking at a few pros boards. So I've spoken to a couple of chaps you might have heard of. So Rob Harris from Jamiroquai sent me a picture of his board that he's going to be taking on tour. And I noticed there's like a Dimension C on there. There's a vibrato. There's a Crazy Tube Circuit Cyclone. There's a couple of other bits. But it looks like there's essentially one drive pedal, I think. The Vemiramp Shanks ODS1. So one drive pedal. Interesting. Then I looked at, I sent Charlie Allen a message. So Charlie Allen plays for Incognito, amazing player. He's sent me what I think is a really neat looking compact little board. And on there he's got a Zen drive, as well as there's the Monty's More switch. So essentially the Zen drive goes in the loop of that, and you've got plus 15 dB in front of it, in front of the Zen drive. The Zen drive's in that loop, and then up to 15 dB after it. So that's kind of interesting. And then I also spoke to Ed from Tone Twins TV, and Ed does similar sort of functiony stuff to me, you know, the stuff we all dream of doing. And on his board, he's actually got a load of pedals. So I guess this is closer to where I am in that. So Rob Harris and Charlie Allen, I think, are basically not doing sort of cover gigs as much, right? So obviously. Whereas I think both me and Ed are doing cover gigs. So it actually is more important to have a range of tones in some way. So he's got like a King of Tone. He's got a Nobel's ODR1. He's got this vacuum tube loop driver, so I think that would probably be loops rather than... It does have a boost on that. He's got an RC booster, which sometimes he swaps in for an SD1 or a Tube Screamer. So there's two, and I don't know what that green thing is. Is there maybe three? But I mean, no, four. So you count the King of Tone as 2 drives. Essentially, you've got Nobel's ODR1, that's another drive. You've got the RC booster or Tube Screamer SD1. So there's potentially like 3-4 drives on that board, right? The important thing for me is that actually switching in and out these drives, once you keep the rest of the board somewhat similar, I think it makes more sense to kind of think more carefully about what each section of the pedal board is actually doing. And so like a drive pedal can do a few things, right? It can be boosting. So you think about something like the Klon or something like that, where you talk about transparently boosting, as well, something like a King of Tone, which is essentially like a transparent boost-ish type pedal, not tons of clipping. You could use a Boss Blues driver in that kind of way as well. But instead of just thinking about it as like giving your amp loads of gain, it could be like, well, we want to just actually boost the level into this thing. So that's kind of boosting. The other thing is like clipping. So the way that I think about this is kind of more like, well, like this Boss OD3 or the Dude, something like that, where it's actually getting you like doing quite a lot of tonal stuff. So it's not necessarily even boosting, could be at unity gain, but getting you like a drive tone. So that for me is more where I'm at, because my amps will always be set clean for like rhythm, like princey funky stuff or whatever. And then I have a pedal specifically for like drive tones. So might be a Nobel's ODR1 X was on the board for the intro. I actually switched it out here for the HRM because it's like, actually I prefer the feel of that. So in some ways, I think tonally, some of these things are actually pretty similar once you start to think about what the actual plan is with them. And then there's like another mode of thinking, which is like stacking. So you might have several gain stages. And this is where I think it gets a little bit messier for me, because in my head, the way that I used to dial in tones I'd have like a 3-channel amplifier, my Mesa Boogie Nomad. And then you'd just try and balance those things, and like actually channel 2 for me was what I would use for rhythm. It wasn't quite what I wanted. Channel 3 for me would be perfect for a lead tone, and then channel 1 was the clean. So it's like a compromise in that way anyway. But I think that's more what I'm trying to achieve with a pedal board, essentially. It's more like a channel switching rig. And then I can chuck the bus on over it, David Barber's bus pedal with Keith. So that's one way I could do it, or you can boost in the front of it. So this is David Barber's Plus pedal, which is something sort of off of the Boss OD1 part of the tree. But what that means is that I can have a boost in front of the ODR1 if I want to, and it doesn't necessarily boost the volume because that's before the clipping stage, and this is a little bit of a thing which I think is important. And then I've got a boost after that clipping stage, but the idea really is that it's still built around that one important clipping stage. Then after, but it got me thinking, like, why do I have all of these pedals if at the end of the day what I'm going to be doing on the board is going to make them sound quite similar. So this Tube Screamer type pedal, I would probably use that as a thing after my gain stage to try and boost the sort of mid signals and get it, you know, audible. That's the way that typically I've used it, unless it's a really bassy amplifier, in which case I would use that, or like missing a load of mids, I would use that sometimes for a rhythm tone. That's another Tube Screamer type. So that's 2 Tube Screamer types we've got there. There's another Tube Screamer type. So 3 Tube Screamers. Now, on my board at the moment, do I have a Tube Screamer? No. So do I actually need a Tube Screamer? I think maybe having one might make sense, but am I going to use it? No, probably not. Boss SD1, basically a Tube Screamer with asymmetrical clipping. So put that in the Tube Screamer pile. Am I going to use that on a gigging board? I don't think so. Now, I've got a Nobel's ODR1. That's an original. It's really clean condition. But what I found when I've used it live, for me personally, is it's got like a little bit too much bass in some circumstances. And, you know, when I was using it for a rhythm tone, it was like, well, actually the bass is kind of overpowering. So for that reason, I think the Nobel's doesn't totally suit my live setup, although it is probably one of my favourite drive pedals. So put that down there. We've got a Boss BD2. Now, actually, I did have on my board for a very long time the JHS Boss collaboration, which has the Angry Charlie and a Boss BD2. That was actually quite useful for having one pedal that would get 2 distinct tones that were actually very useful for a gig. So, for instance, say you got like Sweet Home Alabama in the set. Unlucky, we do. But for that, it was kind of like, well, my main sort of Marshally style rhythm tone doesn't really work so well. So it was quite useful to have that foot switchable, so I could switch that over to the more like scooped BD2 sound. That was the one time that I was really useful. Maybe once during a set I would use that, but not loads. And then the rest of the set I'd be using it for like the Angry Charlie side for my rhythm tones. But I think a BD2 makes sense to have in most people's collection, just as a good example of a drive. And I think maybe a Tube Screamer or an SD1 of some form also makes sense, I think. And an ODR1, I think, probably makes some sense for some people. I've got this here. This is a Marshall 1959. I don't use it. I should probably sell it. But that's like the Plexi type pedal, which actually had a really cool sound. Am I ever going to put it on a pedal board and use it live? I don't think so. J-Rocket Dude and HRM I'll put in the same thing. Now these, I think, are my favourite drive pedals, and they seem to have, like, for me, that really beautiful sort of singing tone, as well as having like a chewy, compressed feel to them, which I really appreciate, and a bit more amp-like than many of my other pedals. So even if the gain is low on these, it does have a really squishy feel, and also the tone control is quite useful in that it is really dealing very usefully with high end, sort of like a high cut. So the Dude and the HRM, I think, probably should be on my pedal board, probably. So they maybe stay there. This is the Crazy Tube Circuits Venus, and I think also I consider this alongside the Tube Driver. I think I've neglected this idea of having a tube in a pedal. Obviously this is quite a bulky thing, but they're a bit classic. I think I'm interested in exploring these a little bit more, because I do think when you sort of dial back the volume on these, because they got a tube in them or whatever is actually going on, those actually respond quite differently, I've found, to my normal pedals that I use. So those are kind of interesting. This is an Ibanez SD9. Now I got that because of the Landau connection, essentially. This doesn't really work terribly well bypassed, so this is kind of just there as a sort of reminder. Would I ever gig this? No, because it doesn't work. But if I put in a switcher, I could. But it's a little bit on the aggressive side, I found, even with the gain quite low. Unless you're doing the Landau thing where your amp is really, really, really cooking, I think this is a little bit on the harsher side. Boss OD3, I really, really like this as an underrated pedal that I think does some really nice things, and a little bit more amp-like than maybe the Boss SD1 and a little bit warmer than the BD2. This could be an ideal sort of rhythm pedal, I think, for me. So that would be like kind of the platform that I think of it as, or potentially as a boost after. Then I guess also this kind of belongs in the tube screamer realm as well. The Zen Drive, which is like a bufferless tube screamer essentially. I've never had it on a board. I think really the lesson for me in this exercise is like looking at Charlie Allen's board, looking at Rob's board. So Charlie has got basically this one drive pedal, which is kind of the key to his sound, right? And he's either going to boost in front of it or boost after it or both. And that's kind of built around one idea. Equally, Rob is building like a sound around one drive pedal, the ODS Shanks, which is basically a Nobels type pedal. From Ed, I think he's got a really clever idea here, which is what I'm kind of noticing, where he's switching out the RC boost, which is, I think, somewhat Tube Screamer-esque. Okay, that pedal section, you know, what I'm using that pedal for, I've got essentially my idea of what could fit in that role, which is essentially a Tube Screamer type role, right? And you can switch out that, but not switching out everything at once, and thinking more carefully about like, okay, is this a boosting role? Okay, and then you've got like your kind of bread and butter drive role, okay, and then you've got your kind of idea around stacking, which is going to be an amalgamation of all this stuff, which gets a bit more complicated. Another key thing though that I've really not been thinking about too much would be about subtractive EQ, because what I'm noticing is that a lot of the pedals that I've got on my board I really quite like for the lead thing, and then when I listen back it's kind of like, well, those are a little bit honky for a rhythm tone. So what I think I could be doing is, instead of like using the EQ to just kind of boost or shape, what I could be thinking about the EQ for would be to actually subtract so that I can get back to my rhythm tone from what is a lead tone, which I actually find like the HRM or the Dude or the Bus can actually do me a really nice lead tone, but when I need it to then sit back in the mix a little bit more, I want like a bit more of just a chunky, less mid-forward rhythm tone, like a crunch tone, then I should be maybe considering using the EQ to then subtract that. So on this side, I've got what I'd think of as pedals that I might use for boost. So whether it be something Klon style, BD2, I quite like for a transparent. That's an actual, just a boost. And at the back, there's a blues breaker from Marshall. What I've got kind of what I'd think of as kind of good core tones that I enjoy, like the feel of them and the tone of them. So whether that's an ODR1 or a J-Rocket Dude or a Boss OD3, then I've got like the Screamer roll, which is actually, I find for me, not going to be appropriate for me to play an entire gig on. Like I can't build an entire guitar tone around that for live playing, but actually it kind of stacks on top of this quite well. Or the other thing that I might be thinking about is that I would just use an EQ to subtract from this what I need or add what I need. And then there's kind of pedals that are outside of these roles, like the Venus or the SD9, or makes sense to categorize drive pedals for me, but also shows me clearly that what I'm not needing is a load more Tube Screamers, and it gives me something to think about, you know, the next time I'm thinking, do I need that pedal, right? Do I need something else that's going to do the boosting role? Do I need something else that's going to fulfill my kind of core tone, crunchy rhythm type role? I definitely don't need another Tube Screamer. Okay, do I want to explore this world of using tubes in pedals or a more hard clipping type thing? Because you'll notice that I don't really have much in the way of hard clipping. The BD2 can do a bit of it, and then the SD9, but it's not typically something I do much of. And I plugged my Les Paul into the board and was like, well, that sounds exactly how I like. So now here plugged in with a Les Paul.